fantasy readers actually like infodumps. Have you ever noticed something strange? Everyone tells fantasy writers to avoid exposition, never infodump, avoid prologues like the plague, show don't tell, and yet fantasy readers voluntarily read books like The Silmarillion. If you ever went down that rabbit hole, you know what I'm talking about, you know. They happily spend pages learning about royal dynasties, the elder and their ancient ways, about forgotten gods and complicated magic systems. So, which is it? Do fantasy readers hate exposition or do they secretly love it? I think we've been asking the wrong question because readers don't hate exposition. They hate exposition before curiosity. And that's the difference. Let's imagine the worst example everyone loves to use. Imagine a novel. My son rushes into the room, his hands covered in green blood, terror in his eyes. Miklosh, I whisper, horror gripping my chest. What have you done? The punishment for attacking one of the green blooded masters is death. Now you're supposed to be interested. Something terrible has happened, la la la, but instead of continuing, I'm gonna do something like this. I will suddenly tell you that 700 years ago, the green-blooded masters crossed the sea from Dirgadel, defeated the Dufnak after the Treaty of the Two Gates, established the Emerald Dominion, reorganized taxation, and a lot of other things you probably don't really care about. And 17 pages later, we are finally back to poor Miklos. Yeah, that's bad exposition, that's infodumping, no way around it. But there's one thing, almost nobody actually writes like that. Unless they're writing a lore encyclopedia, which is fine. I mean, all of us Warhammer nerds understand it. But this example is what everyone uses when talking about infodumps. It's also one that rarely resembles any real fantasy novel. Because good exposition doesn't interrupt interesting scenes, it supports them, and sometimes it creates them. Let's look at books readers actually enjoy. I've taken two examples that are very different from each other, but they're both fantasy, just because. So, my first example is The Princess is a Prince in Disguise. It's a very dark fantasy romance for a very specific audience. The opening doesn't begin with action, it begins with exposition. It explains the Orikai, the mysterious beast people that are also immortal and have special powers. It explains the plague that halved the population and almost wiped out all women. It explains the royal sisters, why princesses are sold away, and why our protagonist disguises herself as a man. Without that two-page explanation, the first chapter makes no sense whatsoever. Now compare that with Elantris by Brendan Sanderson. I know, wild. Completely different audiences, completely different tone, completely different goals. And yet, Sanderson does exactly the same thing. He begins by explaining Elantris. The city was once magnificent, it shone like a jewel, then something happened. Nobody quite knows what. Now it is cursed. It looks like our Eastern European death and gloom aesthetics. It's inhabited by depressed Eastern Europeans. Well, not really, but that's the vibe. And people are exiled there. Well, I can think of a few places that fit the bill. And suddenly, we already understand what exile means when we meet the protagonist. This is exposition, but it creates stakes. These books have almost nothing in common except for one thing. They both trust readers to learn before they leap. And readers are perfectly happy to do it. Why? Because the information matters. The same is true of the Silmarillion. Let's be honest, it's essentially a book of exposition, and yet generations of fantasy readers adore it. Not because exposition suddenly became exciting, but because every piece of lore feels like another window into a world they desperately want to understand. That's the difference. Context is king. It's not a new thought, but it's valid for a dark fantasy romance or an epic fantasy or an urban fantasy or a thriller. People say readers hate exposition. Really? Then why do millions of people spend hours listening to history podcasts? Why do they disappear down Wikipedia rabbit holes? Why do they watch hour-long lectures on Roman politics or medieval warfare or the Balkan Wars? Those are almost pure exposition. with some action. People don't hate information. They hate information about things they don't care about. Curiosity comes first, explanation comes second. When we reverse the order, that's when exposition becomes boring. Ironically, I think show don't tell has made this problem worse. Not because the advice is absolutely useless. No, show don't tell can be wonderful, it can work in some instances, but it often hides exposition. Bad show don't tell hides information. We've all seen those conversations. As you know, Bob, your mother has been missing for 5 years and we can't find her. Characters explain things to each other they both already know, and they're clearly not nostalgic. It's meant for the reader. Or they glare meaningfully across the room while the author desperately hopes that the reader understands that their grandfathers have been fighting a blood feud for 3 centuries. It's showing. Sometimes one clear paragraph is better. Fantasy makes a promise that other genres often don't. When you pick up contemporary romance, nobody needs to explain what a mobile phone is or how text messages work, but fantasy asks you to enter an entirely different world, different politics, religions, history, dynasties, and myths that you can't really map. Learning those things isn't an obstacle, it's what we've signed up for. It's part of the pleasure. Of course, that doesn't mean that every fantasy novel needs 20 pages of world building after every sentence. If you're writing a fast paced thriller, minimal exposition might be exactly what your story needs. Every genre makes different promises. But fantasy is a genre built on imagination, on history, on systems, on cultures, and on ideas. If we become so terrified of exposition that we never explain the world, we risk creating books that move quickly but leave very little behind. Maybe the advice was never avoid exposition, never infodump. Maybe the advice should have been much simpler. Earn it. Earn your infodump. Make me curious first. Then tell me everything. I'll happily spend 20 pages blurting about your empire, your gods, your rune magic, or your 1,000 year dynasty. If you've first given me a reason to care. Fantasy readers don't hate exposition. Fantasy writers shouldn't always avoid it. Actually, both love it. We just call it world building when it's done right and when it's done well. That's the whole difference. I'm Teodora. I write and think about that fantasy, history, and obsession. And subscribe if you want to. And also, yes, I have a cat. Here he is. I just don't want to disturb him.